Good morning. Mark 9, verses 2 to 32. 6 days later, Jesus took Peter, James and John and led them up a high mountain to be alone. As the men watched, Jesus' appearance was transformed and his clothes became dazzling white, far whiter than any earthly bleach could ever make them. Then Elijah and Moses appeared and began talking with Jesus. Peter exclaimed, "Rabbi, it's wonderful for us to be here. Let's make 3 shelters as memorials. One for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." He said this because he didn't really know what else to say, for they were all terrified. Then a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my dearly loved son. Listen to him." Suddenly, when they looked around, Moses and Elijah were gone, and they saw only Jesus with them. As they went back down the mountain, he told them not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept it to themselves, but they often asked each other what he meant by rising from the dead. They then asked him, "Why do the teachers of religious law insist that Elijah must return before the Messiah comes?" Jesus responded, "Elijah is indeed coming first to get everything ready. Yet why do the scriptures say that the Son of Man must suffer greatly and be treated with utter contempt? But I tell you, Elijah has already come, and they choose to abuse him, just as the scriptures predicted." When they returned to the other disciples, they saw a large crowd surrounding them, and some teachers of religious law were arguing with them. When the crowd saw Jesus, they were overwhelmed with awe, and they ran to greet him. "What is all this arguing about?" Jesus asked. One of the men in the crowd spoke up and said, "Teacher, I brought my son so you could heal him. He is possessed by an evil spirit that won't let him talk, and whenever this spirit seizes him, it throws him violently to the ground. He then foams at the mouth and grinds his teeth and becomes rigid. So I asked your disciples to cast out the evil spirit, but they couldn't do it." Jesus said to them, "You faithless people, how long must I be with you? How long must I put up with you? Bring the boy to me." So they brought the boy, but when the evil spirit saw Jesus, it threw the child into a violent convulsion, and he fell to the ground, writhing and foaming at the mouth. "How long has this been happening?" Jesus asked the boy's father. He replied, "Since he was a little boy. The spirit often throws him into the fire or into the water, trying to kill him. Have mercy on us and help us if you can." "What do you mean, if I can?" Jesus asked. "Anything is possible if a person believes." The father instantly cried out, "I do believe, but help me overcome my unbelief." When Jesus saw the crowd of onlookers was growing, he rebuked the evil spirit. "Listen, you spirit that makes this boy unable to hear and speak," he said. "I command you to come out of this child and never enter him again." Then the spirit screamed and threw the boy into another violent convulsion and left him. The boy appeared to be dead. A murmur ran through the crowd as people said, "He's dead." But Jesus took him by the hand and helped him to his feet, and he stood up. Afterwards, when Jesus was alone in the house with his disciples, they asked him, "Why couldn't we cast out that evil spirit?" Jesus replied, This kind can be cast out only by prayer." Leaving that region, they travelled through Galilee. Jesus didn't want anyone to know he was there, for he wanted to spend more time with his disciples and teach them. He said to them, "The Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of his enemies. He will be killed, but 3 days later he will rise from the dead." They didn't understand what he was saying, however, and they were afraid to ask him what he meant. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Good morning. If we haven't met, my name is Judith. I'm one of the occasional preachers here. And I'm very glad that you're all out there, because it's very lonely here in church. Do you ever feel that life is difficult? Do you ever struggle with the suffering all around? Do you ever wrestle with big questions about life? Do you ever feel at 8 a.m. on Monday morning that the week is already overwhelming? If you're like me, listen on, because there's loads in this passage for us. We meet the disciples, shaken and unable to fathom what was happening. We meet people who are struggling with unanswered prayer and suffering in their family. And the curtain is pulled back to show us the reality of the glory of God in Jesus and the reality of the spiritual battle beneath human suffering. This is the first week in our series looking at Mark's Gospel from chapters 9 to the end. So let's take a moment to orient ourselves. Last year, we followed the first 8 chapters, and in that section, Mark is showing us how come the disciples were able to recognize that Jesus wasn't just a shiny new teacher, he was the rescuer sent by God. Now, in the second part of the book, Mark records Jesus teaching the disciples as he purposefully moves towards Jerusalem, where he will be rejected, killed, and will rise from death. Jesus wants them to understand that this has to happen in order to bring rescue for the whole of humanity, for all time, from the evil which spoils life and keeps us separated from God and separated from one another. Immediately before the events we read about this morning, Jesus had shocked the disciples by telling them that he was going to suffer and die, and that for them, and equally for all of us since then, following him means giving your whole life to him. Jesus said, "If anyone wants to come with me, he must forget self, carry his cross, and follow me. For whoever wants to save his own life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for me and the gospel will save it." I'm sure that they wanted to follow Jesus, but were they going to be able to? So Jesus takes them with him up the mountain to pray. They'd seen him perform miracles. They'd heard him speak with authority. But Jesus would have looked to them just like any other teacher. Now their eyes are opened to see the reality of God in Jesus. Elijah and Moses show up. They represent the law and the prophets, which would have indicated to the disciples that Jesus was the fulfillment of all of the promises in God's dealing with Israel. God's voice from the cloud focuses them on Jesus. "This is my son who I love. Listen to him." And then, suddenly, they were left with only Jesus. And that is our message from this passage. There is only Jesus. James, John, and Peter saw the reality of who Jesus truly is. God in human flesh. I'm reminded of the beginning of the letter to Hebrews. In the past, God spoke to our ancestors through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days, he has spoken to us by his Son. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. At the time, the disciples were baffled, frightened, and uncomfortable with this exposure to a supernatural reality beyond their experience. This didn't fit into their worldview, and they weren't comfortable in events so far beyond their control. I can really identify with their response, and with Peter as he blurts out some nonsense because he doesn't know what to do. But they needed this experience if they were going to hold on through the challenges ahead. They needed to see Jesus' glory, to know who they were following, to have hope to cling on to. And we know that it stuck with them. Both John and Peter wrote about it later in their lives. We actually saw his glory with our own eyes. And we need that too. We need to spend time fixing our eyes on Jesus, worshipping him. And I think it's great that at this difficult time, we're working through Mark's Gospel up to Easter. It will give us the opportunity to fix our eyes on Jesus. And I'd encourage you to read along, to take time during the week to let what you learn seep in, to spend time worshipping the Jesus you see, to give thanks. But they've been called to be a part of what God's doing, not just to have an amazing experience for themselves. So they go with Jesus back down the mountain to the valley. Here, they find a scene of disillusionment, argument, and despair. You see, the reason for the glory is the need of this broken world for rescue. What's been happening is that the other disciples have tried to deliver a young man from an evil spirit, but nothing seems to have happened, and they are now embroiled in an argument with the teachers of the law, who are presumably using their apparent failure as a way to rubbish Jesus and his ministry. Am I the only one who sometimes hesitates to offer to pray for somebody, thinking, what if nothing happens when I pray? A quick aside here about the young man described as possessed by a spirit. Because we don't use this language today, we could feel a bit distanced from the story. This reads like a person living with a very severe and frightening neurological condition, and we can understand the anguish of his father. Modern medicine brings some measure of understanding and treatments, which is a blessing. But we lose something really important if we move away from the biblical understanding of this world as fractured and marred by rebellion against God, and this spiritual battle meaning that suffering and loss in this life is inevitable. We all have to live this in different ways with more or less intensity across our lives. I have been increasingly aware through working with people with long-term health conditions that when we focus solely on the medical, we can risk leaving people stranded, cut off from help and hope with the spiritual and emotional challenges they face. So, I'd like to zoom in on what Jesus does now, because here we see what Jesus' glory looks like in the midst of the suffering of human beings. The disciples seem to have lost sight of the boy who needs healing, but Jesus completely ignores the argument raging and focuses wholly on the boy and his father. I have always found this encounter very moving. We see Jesus' deep compassion and his understanding of human suffering. Jesus didn't need the extra information, but his question, how long has he been like this, allows the man to express his pain and how long he has been struggling. How terrible it has been for him. You see, Jesus recognized that there were two people in need of healing here, not only the young man, but also his father, whose faith has been almost blown away by the years of pain and struggle. This man is desperate, and he's pretty much lost hope. Jesus challenges him to choose that small part of him where faith remains. And the father's anguished cry, "I believe, help my unbelief," has inspired me through all my years as a Christian. If you know me well, you would know that I am a mixture of faith in the presence of doubt. My default setting is I trust God and I'm frightened. Jesus' response to this man speaks to me and speaks to each one of us, telling us that we can come to him as we are. I believe, help my unbelief, is my way into prayer. We can bring our faith and doubt, even when doubt looms and we're holding on to faith by our fingertips. Jesus hears our prayers and he reaches out into our struggle to pray at all. So what do we take away for us this week? We need to stay close to Jesus. There is no spiritual self-help formula that will fix things and make life easy. There is only Jesus, and his endless, compassionate love and his power to reach into our lives are all we need. I've written in my notes, prayer, prayer, and prayer, just as Jesus said to his disciples when they were talking at the end of the day. I don't know about you, but I've found this past 12 months that I have needed to pray more, to set aside more time, or to set aside time with more discipline, to make use of the resources out there to help, because I don't find prayer easy, to sit quiet, to pause to pray through the day, to grab opportunities to pray with others. What one thing could we each do this week to help us to pray more? You might be feeling this morning that it's really difficult for you to come to Jesus. Maybe something in life is weighing you down, just like the Father we've met this morning. In my experience, these times are part of our Christian journey. It often helps to ask to pray with others or to ask others to pray for us. And we can still do that even though we can't meet together. You could message somebody. Sarah's going to tell us who's made themselves available to pray with people this week. Or if it's easiest, you could email the church office and ask one of the team to give you a call. It may be that you've been keeping faith at a bit of a distance, maybe always or maybe recently. Maybe keeping it at the thinking level. And Jesus is inviting you to come closer. Don't hesitate. I believe. Help my unbelief. Shortly before his arrest at the end of his life, Jesus' words to the disciples were, I am the vine, you are the branches. Stay closely connected to me. Let's each of us start this week with the intention of doing that.